Hey there, class. So, as I talked about last week, this week we are moving into one of my favorite literary movements, and that is the Lost Generation. So, this video, I'm just going to give you an overview of what the Lost Generation literary movement includes and some of their writers. If this sounds like something that's interesting to you, I'd encourage you to maybe pick this topic up. You could think about it for your next literary analysis or even for later in the class because, like I said, I happen to have a soft spot for this movement, although no biasness on your papers. Okay, so let's just get started exactly what the Lost Generation movement would include. So as we talked about last week, the literature that we're looking at in this module really focuses on post-World War I in America. So as you can imagine, post-World War I also had a generation of young men and women who felt very displaced following the war. If we think about it, one thing I think when I think about these authors is we always picture them as really old men and women with Gertrude Stein, but at one time they were very much so young men in their early 20s, and most of them served in our military and had served in World War I. Ernest Hemingway being one that often writes about his experiences in the war. So the war ended and they return to a society that they don't necessarily recognize anymore. And they also return missing, some historians and critics comment, missing what is considered to be pretty formative years in American culture at that time. So they come back and they feel very uneasy, very unrested, disoriented, and they begin to seek out comfort in friendships and in traveling and in lots of drinking. So we have this group of artists that gradually start to become friends with each other, and they oftentimes are overseas together. They spend many summers in Paris together, and this group of people basically sit around asking themselves what exactly their purpose is and where they see themselves, who they want to be, what exactly their generation is, because they feel very much at this weird spot in their life. If you look up the Lost Generation, you'll see that it's really got its name. Gertrude Stein claims ownership of it in that she dropped her car off to get some work on it, and the mechanic made the comment that everyone in your generation is just lost, because that's what they appear to be with people, because they never really had a home. They just traveled from place to place. They stayed with friends. They were up a lot, like I said, doing lots of partying, lots of art scenes. And it wasn't just reserved for literature. It was art and music and anything in that genre of just amazing people that came together to kind of talk about their struggles in life with each other. But it was really Ernest Hemingway that took off with that conversation of the Lost Generation and wrote about it. And if you've ever heard of the novel or read the novel, The Sun Also Rises, it's probably the best reflection of the Lost Generation, because the novel itself is about a character who is in Paris and he's just hanging out with his friends, and he finds himself in all these weird situations, and he's trying to discover who he is, like through relationships and through writing, which is very much where Ernest Hemingway was as well. And if Ernest Hemingway, you might have also at one point in high school maybe read the novel A Farewell to Arms, which is really based on his experience in World War I and falling in love there. And again, every time I think of Ernest Hemingway, initially you think of the old man in the sea with the beard, but if you look at younger pictures of Ernest Hemingway, which I think puts into context exactly who we're talking about when we talk about the Lost Generation, in that he was, I think, 19, 20 when he served, and then in his early 20s as he began to travel amongst his friends. So Hemingway is by far the most well-known Lost Generation. Gertrude Stein, F. Scott Fitzgerald. I'm sure at one point in time you have read The Great Gatsby, or you have seen the movie at one point in time. The Great Gatsby is another really strong piece that represents this generation. Fitzgerald had himself together a little bit more than Hemingway. He did have a wife, and he was settled down a little bit sooner than the other ones, but he still also wrote about this stage in their life where they were, again, just trying to discover who they were amongst the society. And in The Great Gatsby, that theme is very prevalent, both in Gatsby, who, although wealthy, is very lost, and in Nick, who's trying to fit in with this upper class society and develops a strange friendship with Gatsby, and the elaborate parties and the social class questions. That's another really good example of the Lost Generation. Poetry-wise, T.S. Eliot, who I did put on the syllabus for this week, T.S. Eliot, he is one of the stronger poets when it comes to the Lost Generation, and I assigned 2 poems, and you'll probably recognize bits and pieces of them because they're often quoted because of their themes that reflect this time period. Plus, they're just kind of pretty cool poems. So as you read this week, so some of the themes that are present in The Lost Generation, none of them are very surprising knowing the background of them. But first of all, there's questions of just fitting in society. I mentioned Great Gatsby, that there's questions both from what would be considered more middle-class individuals trying to fit into wealthy society, and then even amongst wealthy society individuals, division of wealth among their old wealth, new wealth, and who's your real friend, who's not your friend, who's using you. So there's just those general questions in the stories that we read of who am I? What am I supposed to be? Why is my life important? So you're going to see a lot of characters as you read struggle with internal dilemmas, but also outward reflections of what's happening around them, just similar to what we talked about last week. And then in addition to that, you're going to see lots of characters that are traveling. We're reading a Hemingway short story this week, and it sets itself up to be The American and Jig. These are characters that you'll come across, but they're traveling together. So there's a lot of traveling in The Lost Generation because that's what they did. They just traveled. And then there's also questions of friendship, questions of loyalty, and I mentioned drinking, I think, a couple times, but they drink a lot, and that's part of the reason why people look down on The Lost Generation, is because a lot of their stories take place amongst these parties, and especially Hemingway and The Sun Also Rises, so much drinking all the time. But that's really how they were reflecting what they knew. It sounds, I think, kind of wasteful and youthful to us at times, and that's probably why those who do not like The Lost Generation, they have their reasons, and I think so, but I've always liked it to be a little personal, because I think that we all go through something similar when we're around that age, and we do start to question what's the next stage in our life, and so I think that to see it play out almost in real time, but also to play out amongst a society that seems so long ago, because it was almost 100 years ago when you think about it, but to see that that's something that everyone experiences. And I happen to think that these writers during this time period not only reflected that angst really well, but honestly, and they were willing to expose themselves, and that's not something that everyone's willing to uptake. And then they also seem to really respect each other in their writing, and they really reflected, I think, the society that they're writing in. Much of what we talked about last week, just all the changes that were happening socially, the racial tensions, the wealth and divide, the reconstruction of the South. This is all the background of this generation as well. And then you put on them the fact that they had been serving in World War I and came back, and now they're trying to figure out what's next in their life. So I hope that you enjoy it. If you don't, it's okay. I'm not going to judge you if you submit a paper that is opposite of how I feel about the Lost Generation. And if you hate them, hopefully next week when we get into Harlem Renaissance, which is my next favorite, that you like it a little bit more. But if you have any questions as you work, always reach out to me, and I look forward to reading your discussions and your point of view about this generation.